The sunset painted the sky in orange hues as the car cut through the highway, leaving Columbus behind. Eric kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his gaze concentrated on the road stretching before him. Beside him, Rachel adjusted the air conditioning, trying to alleviate the persistent heat of the late Pennsylvania summer. In the back seat, Vincent alternated between messaging on his phone and casting distracted glances at the landscape rushing past the window. "How much longer until we reach your parents' farm?" Rachel broke the silence that had dominated the vehicle's interior for the past few minutes. "If we keep this pace, 2 hours tops," replied Eric, checking the clock on the dashboard. "But we have plenty of time." The trip hadn't been planned. A phone call the previous night had completely changed the Mercer family's weekend schedule. Eric's parents, owners of a prosperous farm in rural Pennsylvania, rarely requested their son's presence, knowing the busy life he led in the city as a civil engineer. The call, however, carried a tone of urgency that didn't go unnoticed. "I still think it's strange that your father didn't explain why he wanted to see us so urgently," commented Rachel, adjusting her brown hair tied in a messy bun. "Andrew has never been one for mystery. Dad has always been reserved, you know that," Eric answered, glancing away from the road for a moment to look at his wife. "But I agree there's something different this time." He seemed worried. In the back seat, Vincent finally tucked his phone into his jeans pocket. "You realize we're heading to an isolated farm like in those suspense movies, right?" joked the 19-year-old, leaning between the front seats. "All that's missing is a storm to complete the scene." "Vincent, please." Rachel rolled her eyes, but a smile escaped her lips. "Your grandfather probably just wants to show off the new facilities at the stables. You know how excited he gets about his horses." Silence returned to the car, interrupted only by the soft music coming from the radio. The road began to get more deserted as they advanced into the countryside, with dense vegetation approaching ever closer to the edges of the asphalt. Shadows lengthened with the setting sun, and the first stars began to dot the sky. That's when the unexpected happened. As he took a sharp curve, Eric had to slam on the brakes. A dog, a medium-sized Pitbull, was standing in the middle of the road, staring at the car with fixed, bright eyes. The sudden braking threw everyone forward, drawing a muffled scream from Rachel. "My God!" she exclaimed, bringing her hands to her chest. "Where did that dog come from?" The Pitbull remained motionless, its panting breath forming small clouds in the air that rapidly cooled with the approach of night. Its dirty coat and various marks across its body indicated it wasn't a well-cared-for animal. But there was something more in its behavior, an intentionality that Vincent was the first to notice. "It doesn't look lost," commented the young man, leaning forward to see better through the window. "It's looking directly at us, as if..." "As if what?" asked Eric, tensing his hands on the steering wheel. "As if it wanted us to follow it," Vincent completed, intrigued. Eric honked, hoping the animal would move away, but the Pitbull didn't budge. It just continued standing there, watching them with a disconcerting intensity. "Let's get out of here," insisted Rachel, a perceptible tremor in her voice. "This doesn't feel right. We can call the highway patrol when we get cell service again." Eric was about to drive around the dog when Vincent pointed to the ground near the animal. "Look at those marks on the asphalt," he said. "It looks like something was dragged into that trail." The Pitbull, as if understanding the observation, took a step back and turned its head slightly toward the dense forest, where an almost imperceptible path opened between the trees. "We can't just follow a dog into the woods," protested Rachel, her pale face reflecting the anxiety growing within her. "We're in the middle of nowhere." Eric hesitated, torn between the prudence that had always guided his life and an inexplicable curiosity that the Pitbull had awakened. Methodical by nature, he rarely made impulsive decisions, preferring to analyze each situation carefully. But there was something about that animal, in the way it stared at them, that made him question whether they should simply continue their journey. Someone might need help, he pondered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. What if there was an accident? Or it could be a trap, countered Rachel, the fear evident in her voice. We've heard stories about robberies like this. People use animals to make drivers stop. In the back seat, Vincent observed the dog intensely, noting every movement of the animal. The pit bull remained at a safe distance, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. There was no aggression in its posture, only a silent urgency that the young man could feel even from inside the car. "I think we should check it out," he said finally, surprising his parents. Vincent was usually the first to avoid complications, preferring the comfort of routine to unexpected adventures. "Something tells me it's not a trap. Look at him, he's scared, but he's not running away." Eric exchanged a look with Rachel, who bit her lower lip, undecided. 15 years of marriage had built between them a silent communication that required no words. She knew that, despite the risks, her husband wouldn't be able to continue their journey without knowing what was happening. 15 minutes, Rachel finally conceded, reaching for her bag at her feet. "We take a quick look, and if we don't find anything, we come back to the car immediately." Eric nodded, turning on the hazard lights before parking on the shoulder. The sun had almost completely disappeared, leaving behind only an orange trail on the horizon. The forest surrounding the road seemed to swallow the little light that remained, creating elongated shadows on the asphalt. When they opened the car doors, the cool night air invaded the heated interior, bringing with it the strong smell of damp earth and vegetation. Vincent was the first to get out, walking a few steps toward the pit bull, which backed up slightly, but kept its eyes fixed on the young man. "Hey, buddy," called Vincent, using a soft tone. "What do you want to show us?" The dog tilted its head, as if assessing the young man's intentions, before turning and walking a few meters toward the almost invisible trail between the trees. There it stopped again and looked back, clearly waiting for them to follow. "This is crazy," muttered Rachel, pulling her thin jacket against her body as she approached hesitantly. "Are we really following an unknown dog into the woods?" "Just until we understand what's going on," assured Eric, pulling his cell phone from his pocket to use the flashlight. "No signal," he noted, frowning as he checked the screen. "We're completely isolated out here." The information increased Rachel's discomfort, who instinctively moved closer to her husband. Vincent, on the other hand, seemed increasingly intrigued by the pit bull's behavior, which now slowly advanced along the trail, occasionally stopping to ensure they were still following. As they moved away from the road, the sound of the few passing cars diminished, replaced by the chorus of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the trees. The phone's flashlight cut through the growing darkness, creating ghostly figures in the shadows of the dense vegetation. "Look!" Vincent suddenly pointed, bending down to examine the ground. The flashlight revealed drag marks in the damp soil, as well as human footprints partially erased by recent rain. The marks followed the same path the pit bull was indicating. "Someone was here," concluded Eric, feeling a shiver run down his spine, "and judging by the state of these marks, not long ago." Rachel grabbed her husband's arm tightly, anxiety giving way to concrete fear. "We should go back," she whispered, as if afraid of being heard by something beyond them in the darkness of the woods. "Call the police when we have a signal." Eric agreed with his wife's prudence, but something prevented him from turning back. A persistent feeling that ignoring these signs could result in something terrible. The pit bull continued a few meters ahead, its dark silhouette almost disappearing among the shadows, but its bright eyes remained fixed on them, silently pleading. A few more minutes, he decided, just to see where this trail leads. Vincent nodded, advancing alongside his father, while Rachel reluctantly followed them, each hesitant step betraying her desire to return to the safety of the car. The smell of damp earth intensified, now mixed with a different metallic odor that grew stronger as they advanced. It was when the vegetation began to thin that they spotted, partially hidden among the trees, the metal structure of an old warehouse. The zinc walls were stained with rust, and the roof appeared to have suffered from time and abandonment. A wide gate, ajar, swayed gently with the night breeze, producing an occasional creak that echoed in the silence of the forest. The pit bull stopped a few meters from the entrance, its body showing a caution it hadn't displayed until then. "What is this place?" whispered Rachel, clutching Eric's arm with enough force to leave marks. The abandoned warehouse emerged from the trees like a ghost of metal and rust, its presence displaced in that remote piece of Pennsylvania woodland. Eric directed his phone's light toward the weathered structure, revealing a partially faded sign hanging over the gate. The letters, worn by time and weather, could barely be read. Experimental Station, private property, no entry. Looks like some kind of abandoned laboratory, observed Vincent, cautiously approaching the Pitbull, which remained motionless, its body rigid with alertness. But why would it be in the middle of nowhere? The dog turned its attention to the young man for a moment before advancing toward the partially open gate. Its step was determined now, as if the proximity to the location had renewed its resolve. It stopped exactly at the entrance, looking back one last time, as if inviting the family to follow. "We're not going in there," protested Rachel, her trembling voice reflecting her growing dread. "We've gone far enough. We need to get back to the car and call for help." "Help for what?" questioned Eric, his curiosity now fully awakened. "We don't even know what's in there. It might be nothing. Or it could be something very serious," Rachel retorted. "Why would a dog bring us here if there wasn't something wrong?" Vincent had already moved closer to the warehouse, carefully observing the ground around the entrance. The beam of his own flashlight revealed recent footprints in the damp earth. Human footprints of different sizes, suggesting the presence of at least 3 distinct people, along with paw prints that didn't seem to belong just to the Pitbull that had guided them. "Someone was here recently," the young man confirmed, crouching to better examine the marks. "And not just one person." Eric felt a tightness in his chest. His rational mind told him to turn back, to not get involved in something potentially dangerous. But there was also a sense of responsibility he couldn't ignore. What if someone really needed help? Could he live with himself knowing he turned his back? "Let's take a quick look," he finally decided, ignoring Rachel's disapproving look. 5 minutes tops. If we don't find anything, we'll head straight back to the car." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips when the Pitbull emitted a low whine, almost imploring. There was an urgency in the sound that touched something deep inside her. Reluctantly, she nodded. 5 minutes, she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. Not a second more. The interior of the warehouse smelled of rusty metal, old dust, and something else. A metallic odor reminiscent of blood, though none of them wanted to acknowledge that comparison. The space was vast, with a high ceiling from which broken fluorescent lights hung. The metal walls were covered with moisture stains and rust, creating abstract patterns that seemed to move under the unstable light of their flashlights. In the center of the warehouse, a series of empty cages was arranged in organized rows. Some had open doors, others remained locked with heavy chains hanging from the latches. The concrete floor showed dark stains in several places, and scattered papers indicated that the place had been emptied in a hurry. "What kind of place is this?" muttered Vincent, approaching a metal table where a computer monitor was still on, the screen displaying only a generic screensaver. "Looks like some kind of laboratory," answered Eric, directing his light toward a shelf where several empty vials were aligned, some with partially removed labels. But what were they studying? "Here?" The Pitbull moved silently through the space, its muzzle close to the ground as if following a specific trail. It stopped abruptly in front of one of the larger cages, emitting a low growl that made Rachel instinctively move closer to Eric. "Is there something in there?" she asked, unable to see clearly in the dimness. Vincent was the first to approach the cage, directing his light inside. It was empty, but the floor was covered with dark fur, similar to that of the Pitbull that had guided them, and deep scratch marks on the metal walls suggested that whoever had been there had fought desperately to get out. "I think they kept dogs here," concluded the young man, a note of indignation in his voice. Maybe this was some kind of illegal kennel. Eric shook his head, suspicious. "A kennel wouldn't need to be hidden in the middle of the woods with laboratory equipment," he argued, pointing to another section of the warehouse where medical instruments were organized on stainless steel counters. "This looks more like a research facility." The realization of what that could mean made Rachel bring her hand to her mouth, horrified. "They were experimenting on animals?" she whispered, looking at the Pitbull with new eyes. "Is that why he brought us here? Did he escape from this place?" The dog, as if understanding the question, moved away from the cage and headed to the back of the warehouse where a metal door remained closed. It sat in front of it, its entire body tense, eyes fixed on the doorknob as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge at any moment. Vincent approached the door, but the Pitbull immediately positioned itself between him and the entrance, a warning growl escaping its throat. "He doesn't want us to go in." "There?" observed the young man, taking a step back. "But he wants us to stay nearby." It was then they noticed small red lights blinking discreetly on the ceiling, security cameras strategically positioned to cover the entire space of the warehouse. "We're not alone," muttered Eric, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Someone is watching us right now." As if to confirm his words, a low sound reverberated through the warehouse, the distinct crunch of footsteps on gravel outside, slowly approaching the entrance. The crunch of footsteps on gravel paralyzed the Mercer family. Eric instinctively turned off his phone's flashlight, plunging the warehouse into a dimness cut only by the bluish light of the abandoned monitor. The Pitbull crouched down, the fur on its neck bristling, a contained growl vibrating in its throat. "Get back," whispered Eric, pulling Rachel and Vincent behind a row of empty cages. "Don't make a sound." Rachel's heart was beating so hard that she feared the sound might be heard in the oppressive silence of the warehouse. Her fingers gripped Eric's arm with enough force to leave marks, while her eyes, now accustomed to the darkness, fixed on the warehouse entrance. The footsteps abruptly ceased, giving way to an even more disturbing silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the voice emerged, deep, authoritative, carrying an accent that Eric couldn't identify. "I know you're in there," announced the stranger, without entering yet. "I saw the flashlights. I don't want any trouble. I just want to talk." "No," one responded. Vincent exchanged an apprehensive look with his father, while Rachel held her breath. The Pitbull remained crouched, its muscles tense, ready to attack if necessary. "You don't know what you're getting into," the voice continued. "This place is not what it seems. It's dangerous to stay here." Eric made a decision. With a gesture, he indicated for Rachel and Vincent to remain hidden, and then stepped forward, still partially protected by the shadow of a metal column. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice firm despite the fear growing in his chest. "And what is this place?" A audible sigh came from the entrance, followed by the sound of softer footsteps now. A silhouette was outlined against the little light coming from outside, revealing a tall man with broad shoulders, wearing what appeared to be a security uniform. "My name is Simon Carter," the man answered, slowly entering the warehouse but keeping a safe distance. "I am, or rather was, the head of security for this complex until last night." Eric narrowed his eyes, trying to discern the man's features in the dimness. The Pitbull had moved to position itself between them and the newcomer, its growl more audible now. "I see Brutus found you," observed Simon, looking at the dog with a mixture of admiration and concern. "He's too smart for his own good." "Brutus?" repeated Vincent, partially emerging from his hiding place, ignoring his father's warning look. "That's his name?" Simon nodded, a humorless smile curving his lips. "One of the few who managed to escape when everything fell apart," he explained. "I helped him, actually. I couldn't leave him behind after what they did to him." Rachel finally came out of her hiding place, curiosity momentarily overcoming fear. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What did they do with these animals?" Simon hesitated, as if pondering how much he should reveal. His eyes scanned the warehouse space, lingering on the empty cages, the medical equipment, the powered-down monitors. "Officially, this was an animal behavioral research center," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Funded by a pharmaceutical company called Neurotech, supposedly to study new treatments for neurological disorders." Eric frowned, processing the information. "And unofficially?" Simon sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. "Behavioral control experiments," he finally revealed. "They were developing a compound that drastically altered animal behavior, made them more aggressive or more docile depending on the dosage. Smarter too, in a way." Vincent looked at Brutus, the Pitbull that had guided them there, finally understanding the strange intelligence the animal had demonstrated. "He was one of the test subjects," concluded the young man. Not as a question, but as a statement. Yes, confirmed Simon. Brutus was the most successful of the experiments. He developed an almost human intelligence in some aspects. That's why I was able to work with him to free the others. The others? Questioned Rachel, feeling a new chill. There were more animals. Here? Simon walked to a panel on the wall, pressing some buttons. Emergency lights turned on, bathing the warehouse in a diffuse red illumination that made the environment even more disturbing. 12 dogs and 8 cats, all subjected to the same experiments, he explained, gesturing to the empty cages. We managed to free most of them last night when the project directors ordered the evacuation of the site, but his voice faltered. But what? Pressed Eric, approaching the man. Simon pointed to the closed door at the back of the warehouse, the same one in front of which Brutus had sat earlier. One of the researchers refused to abandon the project, Dr. Robert Mitchell. He was the lead scientist behind the compound. When the board decided to shut down operations after information leaked to the press, he locked himself in the main laboratory with Thor. Thor? Asked Vincent. The first dog to receive the complete treatment. The most advanced of the subjects, explained Simon. Mitchell claimed he was close to a significant breakthrough and wouldn't allow years of research to be wasted. It was then that Eric remembered the original premise that had brought them there. The Pitbull on the road, apparently asking for help. A shiver ran down his spine when understanding hit him. Brutus didn't bring us here just to show us this place, did he? He questioned, his voice low. He's trying to save Thor. Simon looked directly at Eric, the red light reflecting in his tired eyes. Thor isn't just a dog anymore, he said, his voice carrying genuine dread. The last compound that Mitchell tested on him changed something fundamental. And I think Mitchell is no longer in control of the situation. As if to confirm his words, a muffled sound came from behind the metal door, something between a growl and a moan, followed by a dull thud, as if something heavy had fallen. Brutus immediately turned to the door, his ears completely erect, his body tense like a violin string about to break. "What exactly is behind that door?" whispered Rachel, her face pale under the red emergency light. Before Simon could answer, a new sound echoed through the warehouse, this time unmistakably human. A scream of pain, abruptly cut off midway, followed by a silence more terrifying than any noise. The silenced scream left a vacuum in the air, as if time itself had frozen inside the warehouse. Rachel covered her mouth with her hands, her wide eyes fixed on the metal door. Eric instinctively placed himself in front of his wife and son, while Vincent felt the blood freeze in his veins. "Mitchell," muttered Simon, his voice almost inaudible. "Seems like Thor finally lost his patience." Brutus advanced a few steps toward the door, his fur completely bristling now, a continuous growl escaping from his throat. There was a determination in his movements that left no doubt about his intention. "What is that dog doing?" asked Rachel, grabbing Eric's arm with renewed force. "He wants to save the other one," answered Vincent, observing the animal's behavior. "They must have some kind of connection." Simon nodded gravely, approaching the control panel near the door. "Thor and Brutus were the first from the same litter to receive the treatment," he explained, his fingers hovering over the numeric keypad. "They grew up together in the laboratories. They developed a bond that even the scientists couldn't fully explain. They communicate in ways that go beyond normal canine behavior." "And what exactly did they do to Thor that they didn't do to Brutus?" asked Eric, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing fear. Simon hesitated, his gaze lost in emptiness for a moment, as if reliving painful memories. "Dr. Mitchell was always obsessive," he began, carefully choosing his words. "When Neurotech's board began to question the ethics of the experiments, after some incidents he became desperate. He constantly talked about how we were on the frontier of a revolutionary discovery." "What kind of incidents?" pressed Vincent, unable to contain his scientific curiosity even in the face of danger. "The animals began to demonstrate unexpected behaviors, abilities they shouldn't have," answered Simon, typing a sequence into the panel that made a green light flash. "Complex communication among themselves, problem-solving that required abstract reasoning, and in Thor's case, something even more disturbing. An electronic click echoed through the warehouse when the door's security system was deactivated. Brutus immediately positioned himself in front of the entrance, as if ready to face whatever was on the other side. Mitchell believed he could create a bridge between animal and human intelligence, continued Simon, his voice now almost a whisper. In the last few weeks, he intensified the tests with Thor, injecting increasingly concentrated versions of the compound directly into his brain. Rachel felt a wave of nausea imagining the horrors the animal had endured. "That's monstrous," she murmured. "The worst part is that it worked," revealed Simon, his face somber under the red emergency light. Thor began to show signs of almost human consciousness, language comprehension, attempts at communication. Mitchell was ecstatic, calling him the first of a new species. He kept obsessive records of each advance, each new ability that Thor demonstrated. A new sound emanated from behind the door, not a growl or a scream this time, but something that made everyone's blood run cold, a metallic dragging, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. 3 days ago, Thor stopped cooperating with the experiments, continued Simon, his voice trembling slightly. Mitchell was furious. He increased the dosage of the compound, ignoring all safety protocols. When the evacuation order came yesterday, he refused to leave Thor behind. Or perhaps it was Thor who didn't let him leave. "What are you suggesting?" asked Eric, a sensation of dread growing in his chest. Before Simon could answer, the metal door slowly began to move, opening from the inside out. Brutus backed up a few steps, not in fear, but as if he were making room. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft creak of rusty hinges. From the darkness beyond the door, 2 amber eyes shone intensely, canine eyes but with a disturbingly conscious quality that no animal should possess. A pitbull larger than Brutus slowly emerged from the shadows, its black coat marked by scars from medical procedures. On its neck, tiny electrodes were still connected to the skin, linked to a small device emitting a pulsing blue light. "Thor," whispered Simon, his voice loaded with fear and respect. The animal advanced with deliberate, almost calculated steps, its eyes scanning each of those present until they fixed on Brutus. The 2 dogs stared at each other in a silence charged with meanings that escaped human comprehension. "Where's Mitchell?" asked Eric, trying to look beyond the animal into the dark laboratory behind it. Thor slowly turned his head in Eric's direction, his intelligent eyes studying him with an intensity that made the engineer involuntarily back up. Then, the animal simply sat down as if waiting for them to understand something obvious. It was Vincent who understood first, his eyes widening in shock. "Dad," he called, his voice almost failing. "Look at the device on his neck. It's not a monitor, it's a vocal modulator. I've read about similar prototypes being developed for patients who have lost the ability to speak." As if to confirm his words, Thor stood up again and walked to a keyboard connected to one of the still functioning monitors. With surprising precision, he pressed several keys with his muzzle. The screen flickered, displaying a message that made Rachel stifle a cry of astonishment. "He wanted to transform me. I merely completed the process." The silence that followed the message on the screen was so dense, it seemed like a physical entity in the warehouse. Rachel clung to Eric, unable to fully process what she had just witnessed. Vincent was petrified, divided between terror and an uncontrollable scientific fascination. Simon seemed to be the only one not completely surprised, as if he had already suspected what Thor was capable of. "My God," Eric finally whispered, his voice broken by incredulity. "He's communicating with us." Thor turned to the keyboard, again pressing the keys with a deliberate precision that defied canine anatomy. The new message appeared on the screen, each word widening the gap between what they believed possible and the reality they faced. Mitchell underestimated the power of the compound. He thought he could control evolution. Simon stepped forward, maintaining a respectful distance from the animal. "Thor," he began, speaking to the dog as he would to an equal, What happened to Mitchell? Thor's amber eyes fixed on the ex-security guard for a long moment before returning to the keyboard. The new message made Rachel bring her hand to her mouth. He is alive. For now. In the laboratory. Needing medical attention. Eric exchanged a quick look with Simon, the same silent question hanging between them. Should they help the man responsible for all this? I'll check, decided Simon, advancing toward the dark laboratory door. Thor made no movement to stop. Him only observed with those disturbingly intelligent eyes as the man disappeared into the darkness. Seconds later, Simon's voice echoed from inside. He's here, unconscious, with a head wound, but breathing. Eric hesitated only for a moment, before following Simon into the laboratory, leaving Rachel and Vincent with the two Pitbulls. The space beyond the door was surprisingly modern compared to the rest of the warehouse. State-of-the-art medical equipment, sophisticated monitors, and a surgical table in the center, where a middle-aged man lay motionless, a trickle of blood, running from a wound on his temple. We need to get him to a hospital, concluded Eric, checking the scientist's vital signs. His pulse is weak, but stable. Meanwhile, in the main warehouse, Vincent studied Thor with a mixture of fear and admiration. The Pitbull had approached Brutus, and the two animals seemed engaged in some type of silent communication, their bodies expressing a language that escaped human comprehension. Do you think they're talking? Asked Rachel, her voice barely more than a whisper. In some way, answered Vincent, not taking his eyes off the dogs. I think we've always underestimated what animals are capable of. Thor abruptly moved away from Brutus and returned to the keyboard, typing a new message that made Vincent shudder. You don't understand yet. I'm not the only one. Others were taken before the evacuation. Others, repeated Rachel, confusion evident in her voice. Other dogs like you. Thor returned to the keyboard, the message this time longer. Not just dogs. Different experiments. Human volunteers too. Central Institute in Columbus. Address in the files. We need to stop them before it's too late. Eric and Simon returned from the laboratory at this moment, carrying the unconscious scientist. Simon's face paled upon reading the message on the screen. He's talking about the Advanced Neural Institute, said the ex-security guard, adjusting, the weight of the scientist on his shoulders. It's Neurotech's headquarters. I've never been there, but I heard Mitchell talk about the significant advances happening there. Thor turned to the keyboard once more, his movements now more urgent. Mitchell. Has access ID card biometrics. We need him conscious. Rachel shook her head, unable to fully process the implications of what they were discovering. Wait a minute, she interrupted, raising her hands. Are we really considering following the instructions of a dog? As intelligent as he may be, this is madness. Thor stared at her directly, his eyes conveying an intensity that made Rachel back away. He returned to the keyboard. I'm not just a dog anymore. I am what they wanted to create, but not as they expected. And I am not your enemy. Eric exchanged a look with Simon before addressing the most urgent issue. We need to take Mitchell to a hospital first. Then we'll decide what to do. Thor typed quickly. Hospital means authorities, questions, time wasted. I have medical knowledge through the compound. I can stabilize him here. Vincent, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. I think we should trust him. Faced with his parents' incredulous looks, he continued, think about it. If Thor wanted revenge only, Mitchell wouldn't be alive. He clearly has a larger plan? Simon nodded slowly, placing the unconscious scientist on a clean metal table. The kid is right, he agreed. Besides, I know Mitchell well enough to know that if we take him to a hospital, Neurotech will know within minutes. They have contacts throughout the region. Thor was watching the scene carefully, his intelligent eyes moving from one face to another, as if assessing the trust of each. Finally, he returned to the keyboard to type a message that made them all freeze. You are not here by accident. Brutus chose you specifically. Eric Mercer, son of Andrew Mercer, member of Neurotech's board of directors. Your father tried to stop this before it was too late. Rachel turned to Eric, shock stamped on her face. "Your father?" she whispered. "Andrew is involved in this?" Eric felt the world spinning around him. The urgent phone call from his father the previous day, the unusual request that they visit the farm immediately. Everything was beginning to make a terrible sense. "The call," he murmured, understanding dawning like a storm in his mind. He knew something. That's why he wanted to see us so urgently. Thor returned to the keyboard one last time before heading to the table where Mitchell was lying. "Your father discovered the truth yesterday, tried to shut down the project. Now he's in danger." "In danger?" repeated Eric, his voice thick with the revelation. "What do you know about my father?" Thor looked at him fixedly before heading to a metal cabinet in the corner of the laboratory. With his muzzle, he pushed the partially open door, revealing shelves filled with labeled vials and medical equipment. He carefully picked up a syringe with his mouth and brought it to the table where Mitchell was lying. Simon, understanding the animal's intention, took the syringe and examined the label. "It's adrenaline," he explained, looking at the others. "He wants us to wake Mitchell up immediately." Rachel shook her head, still trying to process all the revelations. "This is insane," she murmured. "How can we trust the intentions of this... Thor," Vincent completed. "His name is Thor. And I think he's already proven that he could have eliminated all of us if he wanted to." The young man was right. If Thor really wanted to cause harm, they would be completely at his mercy in that isolated warehouse. The fact that they were, all alive, including the scientist who had tortured him, suggested motives more complex than simple revenge. Eric nodded to Simon, authorizing him to proceed. The ex-security guard skillfully administered the injection into Mitchell's arm, who reacted almost instantly. His body shuddered, his eyes suddenly opening, disoriented and frightened. He tried to sit up, only to be gently restrained by Simon. "Easy, Doctor," he said. "You've suffered a trauma." Mitchell's eyes, still unfocused, scanned the environment until they fixed on Thor. A primitive terror contorted his features. "Keep him away from me," he shouted, trying to back away. "You don't know what he can do." Thor maintained his distance, observing the scientist with a disturbing calm. He returned to the keyboard and typed a new message. "Tell them about Andrew Mercer and Project Prometheus." Eric approached the table, studying the pale, sweaty face of the scientist. "My father," he said, his voice low but firm. "What did you do to my father?" Mitchell seemed to notice Eric for the first time, his eyes widening in recognition. "Mercer?" he murmured. "You're Andrew's son?" "Where is he?" pressed Eric, concern growing with each second. The scientist closed his eyes briefly, as if organizing his thoughts. "Your father discovered Phase 2, he began, his voice weak. "He was just an investor. He shouldn't have had access to the complete reports, but somehow he managed. Yesterday afternoon, he stormed into my office at the Institute, saying he was going to expose everything." "Phase 2?" questioned Simon, frowning. "I thought this warehouse was the entire project." Mitchell let out a bitter laugh that transformed into a cough. "This," he said, weakly gesturing around, "this was just a small preparatory experiment. The real research happens at the Neural Institute in Columbus. Project Prometheus, the complete fusion between human and animal intelligence." Rachel felt her stomach turn at the implication. "My God," she whispered, "what have you done?" "We created miracles," Mitchell replied, a fanatical gleam momentarily illuminating his eyes. The next step in human evolution, Thor, was just the beginning, a test for the compound before we moved on to human volunteers. "Volunteers?" questioned Vincent, skeptical. "Or involuntary guinea pigs?" Mitchell's silence was answer enough. Thor returned to the keyboard, typing furiously. 5 humans in final phase, irreversible neural manipulation. Andrew tried to stop it. They're keeping him in the central laboratory. Eric felt the blood freezing in his veins. The image of his father, always so strong and upright, trapped in some laboratory being subjected to inhuman experiments. "We need to go there," he said, determination replacing fear in his voice. "Now." Mitchell tried to sit up again, this time managing to sit on the table. "You don't understand," he said, staring at Eric. "The Institute is a fortress. Armed security, biometric systems, containment protocols. It's not a place where amateurs can simply walk in. That's why we need you, concluded Simon, understanding Thor's plan. Your access, your biometrics. Mitchell shook his head vehemently. Are you crazy? They'll kill me the moment I step in. There, Larson must know by now that I lost control of Thor. Larson? Asked Rachel. Dr. Victor Larson, explained Mitchell. The real brain behind Project Prometheus. I only handled the preliminary stages with the animals. Thor returned to the keyboard. Larson expects to receive my brain data, doesn't know what. Happened here, we can use that. Eric began to envision a plan, pieces fitting together in his analytical engineer's mind. We can make it look like you're bringing Thor to the Institute, he suggested to Mitchell, as a scientific breakthrough, not as a failure. The scientist's eyes momentarily brightened with interest before darkening with fear. Thor would never cooperate, he argued, not after what? He was interrupted by a new message on the screen. I will cooperate to save the others and Andrew, but with conditions. What conditions? Asked Simon, expressing the doubt hovering in everyone's mind. Thor's response was direct. Permanently terminate the project, free all subjects, and my future and that of my kind will be decided by us, not by humans. The silence that followed was loaded with implications. They were facing something unprecedented, a non-human being demanding autonomy, liberation, and rights. The ethical, philosophical, and social ramifications were immense. I agree, Eric finally said, ignoring Mitchell's incredulous look. But first we need a detailed plan. In the minutes that followed, a strange war council formed in the abandoned warehouse. Thor alternated between the keyboard and the laboratory, gathering necessary equipment and documents. Mitchell, still reluctant but without alternatives, provided information about the Institute's structure and its security protocols. Simon contributed with his tactical knowledge, while Vincent absorbed every detail, his young mind quickly processing the complexities of the plan. Rachel observed everything with a mixture of horror and fascination, until a fundamental question occurred to her. What about Brutus? She asked, looking at the second Pitbull that remained silently beside Thor. Is he coming with us? Thor typed quickly. Brutus will stay safe. He's done his part. Now it's my turn. Eric checked his watch. Almost midnight. Under normal circumstances, he and his family would be arriving at his parents' farm now, being welcomed by a worried but still safe and sound Andrew. Instead, they were about to invade a high-security research institute to rescue his father from unbalanced scientists, guided by a super-intelligent Pitbull. We should leave at dawn, he decided, looking at each of those present. The earlier we get to Columbus, the better our chances of catching Larson off guard. Thor nodded, a gesture so human it sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. The animal typed one last message before withdrawing to rest. Tomorrow we change the IB. Course of history, for humans and animals. While the others organized themselves to spend the night in the warehouse, Eric moved to a quiet corner, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. Still no signal, but he opened the gallery anyway, finding a recent photo with his father. The two of them smiling at a family barbecue, with no idea what fate had in store for them. I'll find you, Dad, he whispered to the image. Hang in there. Morning arrived quickly, bringing with it an overcast sky that seemed to reflect the gravity of the mission ahead. Eric was the first to awaken after a night of restless sleep on an old dusty sofa they had found in an adjacent room. His body ached, but his mind was alert, filled with the information they had discussed the previous night. Around him, the others were beginning to wake up too. Rachel, who had slept leaning against him, slowly opened her eyes, the reality of the situation, returning to her like a cold wave. Vincent was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, checking his phone. Got a signal? Asked Eric, stretching painfully. Partial, answered the young man. Enough to confirm something important. I looked up information about the Advanced Neural Institute and found this. Vincent showed the screen to his father, a newspaper article, dated 2 weeks ago, about a scientific innovation award given to Dr. Victor Larson for revolutionary advances in neural interface. The photo showed a tall man with graying hair and an angular face, receiving a trophy while smiling at the camera with unshakable confidence. Beside him, discreet but recognizable, was Andrew Mercer. "So it's true," murmured Eric. "Dad really was involved with them." "As an investor," reminded Rachel, looking over his shoulder, "he probably didn't know the real extent of the project until recently." Simon approached, accompanied by Mitchell, who seemed to have recovered part of his strength during the night. The scientist looked different in the daylight, smaller, more fragile, without the aura of authority his position normally gave him. "Where's Thor?" asked Eric, noticing the Pitbull's absence. As if answering the question, Thor emerged from the laboratory, carefully carrying between his teeth what appeared to be a small electronic device. He deposited it at Mitchell's feet, who immediately recognized it. "The backup module," said the scientist, carefully picking up the device. "It contains the complete data of all experiments conducted here." Thor went to the keyboard. "Evidence. We'll need this to convince the authorities when it's all over." The message provoked a reflective silence. Were they really considering exposing everything to the world after rescuing Andrew? The implications would be enormous, not just for neurotech and its scientists, but for humanity's very understanding of intelligence and consciousness. "Let's focus on getting there first," suggested Eric, checking his watch. "It's almost 7 a.m. If we leave now, we can reach Columbus before noon." The plan was relatively simple in theory, though fraught with risks in practice. Mitchell would use his access to enter the Institute with Thor, claiming to have made a significant breakthrough that needed to be demonstrated directly to Larson. Simon would pose as his assistant, while Eric, Rachel, and Vincent would wait at strategic points, ready to act as the situation evolved. What if Larson already knows something? "Went wrong here?" questioned Rachel as they headed to the car. "It would be a trap." "That's why we need a plan B," answered Eric, opening the trunk for Thor to enter. "Simon, do you know any alternative entrance to the building?" The ex-security guard frowned. "Thoughtful. There's a loading dock in the back, mainly used to receive large equipment. Security is lighter there, but there are still cameras and guards." Thor, from inside the trunk, tapped his paw against the metal, calling for attention. Vincent understood the signal and opened his phone where the animal could see. Thor touched the screen several times with his muzzle, navigating to the notepad to type his message. "I can deactivate security system. Access codes in Mitchell's memory. He doesn't know I know." Mitchell paled upon reading the message. "You've been accessing my mind?" he asked, his voice trembling with indignation and fear. "How is that possible?" Thor didn't bother to respond, just fixed those disturbingly intelligent eyes on the scientist before settling into the trunk. Brutus, who had observed the entire scene in silence, approached the car, exchanging one last look with Thor before retreating to the entrance of the warehouse, where he would remain safe. The journey back to Columbus proceeded in a tense silence, broken only by brief discussions about details of the plan. Mitchell became visibly more nervous as they approached the city, his pale face covered by a thin layer of sweat. "It won't work," he murmured repeatedly. "Larson will notice. He always notices everything." "Who exactly is this Larson?" asked Rachel from the back seat, where she had squeezed in with Vincent to make room for Simon in the front. "What makes him so dangerous?" Mitchell let out a bitter laugh. "Victor Larson was a brilliant neurosurgeon before dedicating himself to research," he explained. "He has an estimated IQ of 180 and a total absence of scruples. He considers traditional scientific ethics an unnecessary limitation to progress." "Sounds like you admire him," observed Eric, casting a quick glance at the scientist as he drove. "I admire his intelligence," clarified Mitchell. "I fear his ambition. He won't stop with Project Prometheus, even if he has to run over all of us." At noon, they parked a few blocks from the Advanced Neural Institute, an imposing glass and steel building that rose in Columbus's business center. From a distance, it looked just like another corporate headquarters among many others, with no indication of the controversial activities taking place inside. As planned, they separated, Mitchell and Simon with Thor carefully hidden in a large case specially adapted with breathing holes, headed to the main entrance. Eric, Rachel, and Vincent positioned themselves strategically around the building, maintaining contact via cell phones. "We're going in," Simon discreetly informed through the earpiece Eric had improvised for everyone. So far, no sign of suspicion. The minutes that followed seemed to drag on forever. Eric observed the building entrance from a cafe across the street, his heart accelerating every time someone entered or exited. Rachel was positioned near the lateral emergency exit, while Vincent monitored the loading dock in the back. "We're past reception," Simon updated. "Mitchell used his credentials without problems. We're in the elevator going down to the basement. That's where the main laboratories are." Eric breathed deeply, trying to control his anxiety. His father was in there, probably being held against his will, perhaps even subjected to the same experiments that had transformed Thor. The idea made his stomach turn. "There's more security than normal," Simon whispered after some agonizing minutes of silence. "Armed guards in the corridors. Something's wrong." "Abort," Eric immediately instructed. "Get out of there now." "Too late," Simon responded, his voice almost inaudible. "We're being escorted directly to Larsen's office. He was expecting us." The communication abruptly cut off, leaving Eric in panic. He quickly glanced at his phone, seeing simultaneous messages from Rachel and Vincent asking what had happened. It was then that the unexpected occurred. All the monitors in the shop windows around, the electronic panels on the street, even the advertising screen at the corner, suddenly displayed the same image. Neurotech's symbol, followed by a rapid succession of binary code that no one around seemed to notice or find abnormal. Eric immediately knew what was happening. Thor had found a way to access the Institute's digital system and possibly the entire city's. His phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Enter through loading dock, deactivated security. 4 minutes until reboot. Find your father in laboratory C3, Larsen knows everything, trap." Without hesitation, Eric sent quick messages to Rachel and Vincent, instructing them to meet at the back of the building. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he moved quickly among pedestrians, keeping the building always in sight. As Thor had promised, the loading dock door was unlocked, the security cameras powered down, their red LEDs off. There were no guards in sight. "How will we find Laboratory C3?" whispered Rachel, when the three finally met in the loading area. "I know where it is," answered Vincent, surprising his parents. Faced with their questioning looks, he explained, "Thor sent a schematic map to my phone. I have the complete floor plan of the basement." Guided by Vincent, they navigated the sterile corridors of the basement, tensing at every corner, expecting to encounter guards at any moment. Surprisingly, the path remained clear, as if Thor was remotely controlling not just the security systems, but also the movement of personnel. Finally, they reached a steel door with C3 engraved in metal letters. Eric was about to push it when Rachel stopped him. "What if it's another trap?" she whispered. "Thor said Larsen knew everything." Before they could decide, the door opened from inside. Andrew Mercer, looking exhausted but unharmed, stared at them with an expression of absolute shock. "Eric? Rachel? Vincent?" he stammered. Why are you here?" "Dad?" Eric rushed forward, embracing the older man tightly. "We're here to get you out. We know about Project Prometheus. We know everything." Andrew moved back slightly, his eyes nervously scanning the corridor. "We don't have much time," he said in a low voice. "Larsen is keeping Mitchell and your friend in the main laboratory. He knows about Thor. In fact, he was counting on it." "What do you mean?" asked Vincent. Andrew took a deep breath, looking directly at his son. "The real objective of Project Prometheus was never to create intelligent animals," he explained quickly. "It was to study how consciousness could be transferred and amplified. Thor was just a preliminary test. Larsen wants to use the same process on himself." A shrill alarm began to sound throughout the building, red lights pulsing in the corridors. "The Shakai. A system is rebooting," concluded Vincent. "We need to go now." They ran through the corridors following Andrew's directions, who knew the way to the main laboratory. As they turned the last corner, they found 2 guards lying on the floor unconscious. "Thor," murmured Eric. "He's 1 step ahead." The main laboratory door was ajar. Through the gap, they could see a spacious room dominated by sophisticated medical equipment and large glass tanks filled with a bluish liquid. In the center, a chair that looked more like an instrument of torture, covered with electrodes and monitoring devices. And there, standing before a control panel, was Victor Larson, tall and imposing as in the photo, but with an expression of almost childlike fascination as he observed Thor, who was in the center of the room, free from the case, staring at the scientist with predatory intensity. Simon and Mitchell were immobilized in opposite corners of the room, watched over by armed guards. None of them noticed the Mercer family observing through the gap in the door. "Fascinating," Larson's voice echoed through the room. "You really transcended the limits of your species, didn't you?" Mitchell had no idea what he had created. Thor remained silent, his intelligent eyes never leaving the scientist's face. "You don't need to pretend with me," continued Larson, approaching cautiously. "I know you can understand every word. I also know you manipulated the Institute's systems since you entered the building. Impressive, I must say." On a nearby monitor, words began to appear. "What do you want from me?" Larson smiled, a smile devoid of true warmth. "Your brain," he answered simply. "Or more precisely, the neural patterns that the compound created. The true emergent consciousness. I'm going to extract them and integrate them into my own brain." "That would kill you," appeared on the monitor. "On the contrary," Larson retorted, "it would elevate me. Imagine a human brain with your accelerated processing capacity, your expanded perception, the next stage of human evolution." It was at that moment that Eric realized the plan had never been to save Thor or expose the project. The plan had always been to lure Larson into a trap, putting him exactly where Thor wanted him. As if to confirm his suspicion, all the laboratory equipment suddenly came to life, monitors rapidly flashing, machines humming in unprogrammed sequences. Larson looked around, alarm replacing confidence on his face. "What are you doing?" he demanded, running to the main control panel, only to find it completely locked. The words on the monitor changed. "Showing the truth to the world." On screens around the laboratory, images began to appear, videos of the experiments, data records, confidential emails, illegal financial transfers, the entire dark history of Project Prometheus being transmitted not just to the Institute, but to the outside world. "No!" shouted Larson, desperately trying to regain control of the systems. "You don't understand. This is the future of humanity." Thor finally moved, approaching the scientist with deliberate steps. There was no aggression in his posture, only an unshakable determination. On the monitor, a final message appeared. "The future belongs to all conscious beings, not just humans, not just you." Eric pushed the door completely open, entering the laboratory with Rachel, Vincent, and Andrew. The guards, distracted by the chaos of the systems and the confrontation between Thor and Larson, didn't immediately react. "It's over, Larson," declared Eric. "The authorities are already on their way. Thor transmitted everything." The scientist turned, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You don't know what you're doing, Mercer," he hissed. "We're on the verge of the greatest scientific revolution in history, and you're throwing it all away because of a dog." "It's not just a dog," Andrew corrected, advancing to stand beside his son. "It's a sentient being that you and your colleagues created and then treated as property. The true evolution is in recognizing consciousness wherever it exists, not in stealing it for your own benefit." Sirens could be heard in the distance, rapidly approaching. Larson looked around like a cornered animal before making a desperate move toward a red button on the main panel, the laboratory's self-destruction protocol. Thor was faster. With an impressive leap, he knocked down the scientist, keeping him immobilized on the floor without hurting him. His intelligent eyes met Eric's, a silent communication passing between them, the mutual recognition of two different but equally valid consciousnesses. When the police finally stormed the laboratory, they found a surreal scene: surrendered scientists, computer systems displaying irrefutable evidence of unethical experimentation, and a Pitbull sitting calmly next to the Mercer family, observing everything with an intelligence that defied conventional explanations. Weeks later, as the Neurotech case dominated global headlines and provoked intense debates about scientific ethics and non-human rights, the Mercer family gathered on the porch of Andrew's farm. The sun was setting on the Pennsylvania horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Thor and Brutus ran freely across the fields, occasionally stopping to exchange looks that seemed to contain entire conversations. No special commission had been formed to determine the legal status of the animals, modified by Project Prometheus. But until then, Andrew had insisted on offering refuge to all of them on his property. "Do you think they'll be okay?" asked Rachel, observing the two pit bulls playing in the distance. "They're more adaptable than we imagine," answered Eric, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. "And much smarter too." Vincent, who had spent the last few weeks meticulously documenting the dog's behavior for his newly initiated study of neuroscience, smiled as he saw Thor abruptly stop his running and look directly at the porch, as if he knew they were talking about him. "I think we've always underestimated the potential for consciousness around us," reflected the young man. "Perhaps the greatest discovery wasn't creating a new form of intelligence, but finally recognizing that we were never really alone on this planet." Thor seemed to agree, nodding almost imperceptibly before returning to run with Brutus. Two extraordinary beings exploring together a future that no one could have predicted, a future where the boundaries between species were finally beginning to dissolve.